Welcome back. As emotional intelligence becomes more prominent in New York City schools, educators may need to adapt or update their curriculum. Understanding the benefits of social emotional learning, the Senior Director of SEL for the Urban Assembly, Dr. Brandon Frame, plans to make this a nationwide effort, leading the largest SEL program in the country. Dr. Frame joins me now to discuss social emotional learning and the long term impact it could have on students. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, can you tell me a little bit more about the Urban Assembly and the work your organization does?
Yeah, the Urban Assembly mission is to advance students' social and economic mobility by improving public education. I have the opportunity to lead the social emotional learning department where we want to advance students' economic and social mobility by infusing social emotional learning into schools and ensuring schools are successfully doing that around implementation.
Now, I'm curious to learn a little bit more about social emotional learning. Is this something new? And then can you just explain what it actually is?
It is not something that's new. Social emotional learning is the process through which children and adults develop the skills, attitudes, and values to manage life tasks such as cognitive learning, forming relationships, and the flexibility to adapt to challenges and expectations of a complex society. Ultimately, these are skills that we use in order to be successful in everything that we do from work to school in the community.
Okay, so you said it's not new. So I'm curious to know maybe what inspired this kind of charge for more schools and educators in New York to kind of, and across the country, to kind of, be a little bit more interested in this type of learning.
Social emotional learning definitely been around for a very long time. I think that the pandemic has created or caused schools to prioritize the social emotional development. But it's important to name that this is something that has needed to happen for a very long time. We both can probably relate to learning the Pythagorean theorem. We can relate to learning about mitochondria and photosynthesis. I mean, those are very important things that we do need to know. We need to read and be able to write. But we're sitting here right now because of our social emotional skills that we've used to navigate the world. And so I think people are starting to see like, well, we really need to develop these skills because again, even with employers, what are employers looking for? Unless you're teaching math or teaching science, you might not use some of that information, but you are going to use your social emotional skills in order to get to that job, to do well in that job and to move forward.
Now, as you mentioned, which kind of brought me back a little bit like the Pythagorean theorem and, the powerhouse of the cell, all that stuff, we could kind of think back and remember what that looked like and while we was learning that in school. What does SEL look like in school? And is this something that kids are aware that they're possibly learning?
I love that you asked that question, even the way that you phrased it. And so one, it can look a lot of different ways. One is creating time in the school building to have a particular period that is directly and intentionally teaching social emotional learning skills. It also is sitting with teachers to work on how are you using your pedagogy to activate and teach social emotional skills while you're teaching math and science. And to your point that you just said in your question is like, we have to make sure that's explicit and intentional. When we teach math, it's explicit and intentional. When we teach reading and so on, we need to teach social emotional learning skills. One thing I like to say sometimes is that when students are struggling with math, what do? We ensure that they get interventions to learn math. When students are struggling with reading, we make sure they get the interventions to learn reading. When students are not as strong with their social emotional skills, oftentimes they get punished. Right. And that could be different ways in terms of how we treat it around grades and even behavior and different policies. Right. So it's important that what does it look like, though, when all students are developing their academic skills alongside their social emotional skills in an explicit and intentional way?
Now, I'm really glad that you brought up like the idea of like sometimes punishment being something used when a child or a kid or a teenager isn't maybe behaving in a way that is, I guess, beneficial to the environment. I kind of wanted to bring up, how this could benefit children in schools in low income communities where we see oftentimes they are punished. If maybe something going on at home and they bring it to school instead of maybe tapping into SEL, they are faced with like detention or in-house, suspension. How could this benefit children from low income areas or children from troubled backgrounds?
Yeah, I think one thing what I love about social emotional learning and when we center it as skills is to even name that it is for all students to develop these skills because it's what we use to be in community with each other and even thinking about in different particular areas. these are the skills that you use to navigate the trauma, to navigate the frustration, anxiety of what happens in your community. And by developing these skills, we're able to move through these challenges that we face. Even when we run into mental health challenges are almost inevitable, but how do we navigate them? Social emotional skills. Learning, the process of learning is frustrating. We can all think about something in the last 6 months. We tried to learn, do something new, and it was frustrating. Going back to being in school, there was that subject that everybody had. It's like, that's that challenging subject. And how will we navigate that frustration, that anxiety? You use your social emotional skills. And so it is beneficial for every single student, even as we get into conversations around equity. We get talking about ending racism and going into those topics, and how do we talk about sexism. You have to use your social emotional skills in order to have those conversations to then get to the end state of changing policies and improving our communities.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question. How does the Urban Assembly use SEL to build empathy and reduce bullying and disciplinary issues?
Yeah, so we've created the Resilient Scholars Program, and the Resilient Scholars Program is a guided implementation model to help schools and districts and communities be able to implement social emotional learning with fidelity. So it's an opportunity to look at the activities, the interventions and supports, and align them to social emotional learning competencies and indicators. So now we're looking at all the things that we kind of sometimes take for granted, the things that we just do, and say, what social emotional skills are these things teaching, right? Because going back to what we were talking about, which is explicit and intentional, so often throughout our lives, our social emotional development has happened implicitly, like life experiences, things happen, we develop self-awareness, we develop empathy, as opposed to what would it look like if we are explicitly and intentionally taught that from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And what does that look like once we walk across that stage and move into the complex society that we live in?
And this kind of just came to me just now, but how does social media, because I know when you're teaching children, social media and the internet plays just a huge part. How does that affect some of the work that you do and possibly like, what they're learning online, which is a part of their development? Does that conflict with what their, SEL and what they could be learning at school?
I think social media gives us the opportunity to even elevate why teaching social emotional skills is important, because as we teach strong social emotional skills, especially around communication, that helps impact the discourse that people would have even as they're talking to each other on social media, as well as the content that they're consuming, and being able to delineate between what's right, what's wrong, what should I actually be consuming versus what I don't. Because the big thing about social media is that you get to choose who you follow, right? So if we develop really strong self-awareness skills, you can start to say, well, I probably shouldn't follow this, or maybe this is information that I probably shouldn't consume because it does make me feel some type of way.
Now, how can this impact, or what can educators learn from this form of teaching? Because we talked about how it affects kids, but how does it affect adults?
So absolutely. So one, adults, almost all adults in the current state did not go to schools where they were explicitly, intentionally taught social emotional learning skills. So one, in order for us to model it, we as adults have to take time to develop our social emotional skills so that we can model it for our students. That's so super important around this work. And then from there it becomes, well, what does it look like to take that and put that into my pedagogy as I teach students, so that now not only am I modeling it, but I'm helping students develop social emotional skills that I know not only will create an amazing school community, but when they walk across the stage, when they leave the school building, they are going to be able to flourish in the community and allow for the community to be strong.
Now that goes into my next question. How will this actually benefit kids and their social development beyond schools? So when we're talking about when they're young adults, when they're older adults, how will this benefit them in the long term?
So thinking about the definition, when you asked me what is social emotional learning, and I was like, it's about these skills to navigate a complex society. The truth is we live in an extremely complex society with different viewpoints and ways people think life should be. And how will we even have conversations, and how will we create the communities that we want to live in, is developing these social emotional learning skills. I thought about as I was walking in the school right here, the Walton campus, and there's a school there, International School for Liberal Arts, and one of the schools that we work with, and they do this phenomenal job in terms of developing their young people with their social emotional learning skills. And I've seen our young people go off into college and then go off into the real world and be able to navigate, be able to get the jobs that they want, to be able to flourish in those jobs. and also start families and have amazing families because of the strong social emotional skills that they develop while being in our schools.
Well, it's also so clear that you're very passionate about this, and I want to know, what inspired you to advocate for this type of learning, and what are some ways that you've actually seen it, see the benefits of it?
Yeah, so as I've navigated my own educational career, I saw that social emotional learning was the key to success. I started looking at different data points. So, for example, when somebody's ever gotten fired, why are they usually fired? It's usually a social emotional skill. When you look at why people get divorced, it's usually social emotional skill. And even being as a male, as a black male, thinking about what does it look like for me to develop the empathy, to develop the compassion, and to develop the skills that would allow for me to be the leader that I want to be in the world. Social emotional skills was the key piece, right? I did well in school. I can read, I can write, but what was going to push me over the top and what is going to allow for other people to reach their potential? And it's the social emotional skills. So that's what drove me to be that passion and then want to travel around the country and work for the urban assembly. So to create the same conditions in other communities.
Well, I also want to add, you brought up something that's so important, and you talked about being male. And, I can imagine, like, you know, emotion, anything with emotions, and when you mix that with male, sometimes it could be complicated for a lot of young men to navigate. Can you just explain the importance of that, and especially when you're dealing with maybe boys in middle school or even high school, how you help them navigate that?
Absolutely. It's of the utmost importance that we prioritize the social emotional development for our young men. I mean, there's so many different data points that I could use to be like, hey, this is why. But I know so many men grow up, so many boys growing up to men. But when we were boys, we said boys don't cry. Boys don't show emotions, and how that actually plays a role in our lack of development to be able to communicate effectively with each other and with women. And so when we prioritize the social emotional development of boys, it allows for us to actually flourish and be the men that the community needs, that society needs, and be the men that we need to be for ourselves. And so that's a really major point of why I wanted to get into social emotional learning, is because I know how important it is for men and how different the world would be when we think about the social emotional skills, and we talk about empathy, we talk about compassion, we talk about vulnerability and what it means to be a comprehensive man, and don't allow your masculinity to just sit in one aspect of masculinity, but it becomes a full range because you tap into the other aspects of masculinity, because masculinity does include vulnerability, empathy, and compassion. When you have that together, that means that, wow, you're an amazing man that can lead his family, that can lead the community, and be an active member of society.
Well, Dr. Owen, thank you so much for joining us and have this really interesting conversation. We got to touch on some points that I didn't even think of prior. So I appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
You're welcome.
If you work for or a parent of a student in a school and you want to learn more about SEL, please go to their website at www.urbanassembly.org. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. You can catch a brand new episode of Open with Darren Hymie on Wednesday and Rena Valentine on Friday. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.